why is this important? Why would we want to, consider not writing code, right? We're developers, get paid to code. Well, that's true, but also not necessarily right, or the only way to think about it, right? So I found this out a little while back as I was doing some research. Back in, so granted, it's probably even more now, being a couple years since this, but back in 2018, holistically, as basically an industry in the U.S. alone, we pretty much wasted close to $3 trillion on bad software. Like, it's just this dynamic of, like, there's a lot of money put into what we do. Technology is, right, a hot space now. A lot of perspective there, but this gives some good perspective to some of the dynamics that play through, and why and how things play about in again, meaningful ways. So of course, system failures, things like that, that's a big chunk of it. That's just going to be natural. But legacy problems, right? All of us probably have some context to legacy code. Anybody that knows me and has hung around with me for a while knows that my version of legacy code is the stuff I wrote before lunch, right? So it's the idea of, like, code can change pretty quickly. My short-term memory is like, oh yeah, who did this? I did that? What's this about? And trying to figure that stuff out, kind of stuff. So, obviously legacy contexts play in. Technical debt, huge. The idea of those conscious choices we made to not do something, versus defects and issues being the things that we got wrong for whatever reasons. So, as that plays through, and then obviously even just the idea of 6% based on 3 trillion. At some point I did the math in that, but I forgot the number. But that's definitely in the billions of dollars of wasted, canceled projects, right? The stuff that we just started and decided not to do at some state, and realizing, like, could we have learned those lessons sooner? So just a lot of money that goes into this, and obviously money is the kind of raw nature of a lot of what we do, right? Even from a time perspective, time equals money. It's real. So just something to put in perspective of, like, oh, there's a lot that goes on with poor quality code, let alone code in general. Of course, you would hope that regular code gets a return on investment, but at least the wasted stuff is money just kind of gone, and something to think about. So just a couple other dynamics, right? So code is expensive, right? It's hard to write. There's delays that get involved with it, right? Whether it's delays to the market or delays to going in production or whatever it could be. There's a cost usually correlated to that, and of course, we all understand that code is complicated, and it generally usually gets more complicated as time goes on. So realizing that there's a cost even to that, and then also we as builders are expensive, right? And I personally am cool with that. That makes sense for us. If we're in a talent-driven, skilled, kind of rare place where we can, charge a good rate for the stuff we're doing, and as businesses can make good money off of building, quality products and software in a sense. So that's a good place to be, of course. And like I said, if we can keep it that way, that's actually a good thing. But it just means things, right? And understanding, again, why sometimes it's better to not write the code. This idea of, us being skilled and us being dedicated is absolutely true. Cool. So before we jump in, I don't know if that sparked any thoughts or any things that we're going to play into. Like I said, it's probably about 5 to 6 or so of each of these different perspectives, some figurative things. And I probably should have clarified before we got too far into this. I'll go ahead and throw it out there now. In case you hadn't got it from the description and different things, even though we built the group up to be a coding group, this is definitely not a coding talk. However, certainly with the folks listening in and being able to participate in the conversation, happy to draw out if you have any kind of working example. Like, hey, there was this time we were working on this code and that perspective played in. Feel free to draw that stuff out. I think that would be awesome. One of the things I do want to do to this deck at some point in time is make it more code focused and being able to draw on some real examples. But as we talk to these different techniques, both figurative and iterative, I don't get a lot into a coding perspective, no coding examples or things of that nature. So just want to throw that out there. If you were really, really hoping to get deep down into code tonight, I'm a true believer in the theory of 2 feet. If there's something more important else you could take part in, go ahead and feel free to do so. So should have stated that before we started 10 minutes ago, but here we are. So All right, jumping into these techniques. First one we're going to cover, and I also should have stated, you are going to get a whole lot of acronyms out of me tonight, and hopefully in a good, meaningful way. Hopefully all easily understood. But I like the acronyms because they're catchy and they're convenient. They're easy to remember, and they're fun to call out within the team room. Like our first one, right? If you're talking about something, and you're working through something, and all of a sudden you could just yell out, "Yagni!" It's like, oh, what the heck's that? Like, what? Cool. Like, okay, cool, I get it. So our first technique here is just this idea or concept of like, you're not going to need it, right? A lot of times we as builders build the things because we either have the opportunity or we think it's going to be cool, or we want to, go that extra mile to prove our value. All of those are just, right perspectives. Good to have, but usually from a code perspective means we maybe don't need to do it. And it stems from like this idea, like lines of code are technically a liability, right? There's a cost to it. So rather than thinking about, hey, look at all these number of lines I produced, right? Look at this, 1,000-line method I created. Isn't it fantastic? No, it's usually not. And by the way, think about it in a different, like how many, lines did you spend, right? Because every single line has a value to it, has a cost in a sense. So your 1,000 lines actually cost more money than if you had done a 500-line method, right? Like, and that's just a different way to think about it, and something to be, again, mindful of. So to get a little bit more explicit there, the lines of code saved directly equals dollars not spent, right? And there's times when that's appropriate, right? Certainly think of a startup where they're limited funds, they're trying to get to market early. That just means more you could put into something else, and that's really powerful. And of course, minimizes waste. Whenever we can clean up the things we don't need, that's really important and really powerful. So our buddy Joel that's out there listening in, he's helped me with a few different concepts. I think he maybe had introduced this concept to me at some point in time. He's like, oh yeah, I was working with this group and they're basically working on this delivery service app. It was basically voice controlled. Like you can just tell your phone, hey phone, get me a pizza from somebody's, pizza place, right? Won't throw out any names. And it was like, well, you don't need an app for that when they can just simply hit a pre-programmed memory dial phone number. It instantly connects, might ring for a few seconds, and then you just say, bring me a pizza, right? Like they'll do the same thing, right? So why would you build an app for that? Or why would you need that if you could just do it in a different way, or do it in a way, excuse me, that already existed even, right? Like there's a perspective to that and being able to have those types of correlations. So any thoughts from the group on Yagni, or any perspectives you want to draw?
I have a question, Daniel. So you're talking
James,
about you're talking about not spending the money by not writing lines of code. But does this apply? How well does this apply with refactoring, where I have already written the lines of code, but now they're there, I'm going to have to maintain them, or I could refactor and reduce the number of lines?
Awesome. So great question. Thanks, James. To me, it's both. Obviously, there's a cost in spend in a sense and actually writing it, but there's also a cost in holding on to it, right? The idea of those are lines of code that are still going to exist for some period of time and may cost us something later, certainly from that perspective. So being able to trim the fat in a sense, which I kind of consider refactoring being able to do, it's reducing those numbers. So you might have needed it to get there, right? But you figured it out, now you're good. Now you want to clean it up and get rid of some of that. That's it's spending a little to save a little, right? And I always kind of go to my normal correlation of, right, you either pay now, pay later. We maybe paid a little now to save a little later in a sense. And it's that idea of like refactoring to me is it's additional spend, but also additional savings. And usually I would suggest worthwhile. It's worth that spend, yeah. But that's a great perspective. And I don't think I'd actually thought of it from that kind of angle, which was awesome. Good question.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Cool. All right. So I think this will kind of just be the flow. I'll bring the concept, kind of talk to it a little bit. And those that want to weigh in, of course, you can wait till we're shifting, but feel free to interject along the way too. All right. So our next one. Yeah. Not a very pleasant, fun, cool acronym in a sense, but not invented here. Maybe you could, those with an accent could say it, like maybe it's NIE, right? Or maybe a good German voice could say this acronym, NIE, right? Or something like that. But this is the idea of, not invented here. So there's a few different perspectives that play in, right? Sometimes you can beg, is like, maybe it already exists and you can just borrow it from another team, or repurpose it in a meaningful way. Maybe you want to borrow it. Maybe it's, again, rewritten or already written, and you can borrow it to repurpose it, but you don't have to reinvent it, right? Don't reinvent the wheel if it's already rolling. Steal. Now, of course, I mean stealing as in, it's okay to borrow good code if it's used for learning and driving something. So maybe you'll steal, air quotes, some code in order to learn, right? And play an experiment or work a spike card in a sense. And that's good if, of course, you're stealing to just, make profit and are trying to be, in the sense, shifting from the white hat to the gray or the black hat hacker perspective there, then that's probably bad. But knowing the difference is certainly okay. And then my favorite here is, like, we kind of all were raised, and usually it's a normal thing. I'm teaching my kids this now, right? Don't cheat. You don't win if you cheat. Well, I kind of like go back on that now with teams, and I'm like, well, if you could just cheat, right? Just find a way to make it work. That's probably okay, right? And again, in a meaningful way that's not, stealing and not discrediting other folks, and or giving credit where credit's due. But this is, to me, like the whole driver of the open source realm, right? It's the idea of, why go through all the pain if we can just kind of cheat, get to that thing we need, and make it real? Like, that's a good thing. So this is a cool perspective. Like, there's this fine line when it comes to relying on others' code. Make sure the source is trusted and reliable, and of course, test protected as if it's your own. So for any of these things that we maybe beg, borrow, or steal, or even cheat for, realize that there's inherent risk. And that's just a caveat to this, of like, okay, cool, how do I protect myself from that thing, right? Certainly if it's open source, you maybe trust it, and you maybe trust that even it was, appropriately unit tested, cool. Like, if you can get all of that value, great. But maybe you still want to put your couple, smoke tests around it, or, characterization tests around it, to just say, hey, that thing's currently doing this thing. And if it changes in some meaningful way, I'm going to know about it via a test, versus, some broken dependency, or some broken build, or some, obviously bad scenario of, like, your broken software. So again, all the context behind this not invented here perspective is, it's okay to reuse. Don't reinvent it if you don't have to. Learning's good. And again, it's that fine line of, what you borrow in a trusted sense, versus, being able to protect it and test it. Any thoughts to this guy? Not invented here.
Hey, Dan, I think that this kind of rings true with me a lot. I've been at this game for a long time, and I think, like, you can always kind of Google and find someone who solved a similar problem, right? Stack Overflow, all that stuff. And so I think it's like the most fearful time in my career is if I'm trying to find some help, and there's no results coming back. And then I know, like, I'm probably doing something very wrong, because I don't buy that anything hasn't been solved, at least at a micro kind of method level. So
I agree, Bryce. I tell people all the time. I tell people all the time at work, like, you're not unique. We're not unique. Someone else has solved this problem. Let's go find out. And I realized I had wandered into a truly different space with what I do specifically right now when I started hitting Stack Overflow, and literally no one had solved the problem yet.
It's one of two things. I like that both perspectives played in there. Like, James, you're saying, hey, maybe we are truly blazing new ground, and that's cool. Like, all right, here we go, we're on our own. Or Bryce, your perspective of, like, how far off am I if that I'm like that broken that I'm not even getting any results? Like, a very good perspective to have either way. But I think, to me, it's the opportunity or ability to try that first, and then learn from it, and then move on, right? So it certainly plays in. Awesome.
I think this is kind of like a dirty little secret of developers. I don't think management knows how much code is actually Googled or copied. And I don't think they evaluate people in a way that would incent that. They tend to think that they all wrote it from scratch, and we work very closely with teams, and I know, James, you probably could agree. I was amazed at how much time was actually spent Googling, which tells me that you don't need to be an expert. You just kind of need to know just enough. because there is a lot of information out there that you can rely on.
I think when I interview people, or when I kind of vet someone that's come on a team, I care way more about their ability to find answers than not even comparable to what they know. I couldn't care less about what you know if I know that you can figure it out.
Yeah, because it's going to change.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Cool. Fatimi, I think that's maybe how we could say this one. Joel and I briefly discussed this a little bit ago, but fake it till you make it, right? This plays through from a few perspectives. So obviously all the ideas and perspectives we can use from a technology, right? And the builder's perspective, like being able to take advantage of mocking, faking, stubbing, any of the frameworks that will support the idea of, testing in a meaningful way. And again, it's like the actual thing isn't made until you know you need it, right? Don't create it until it's proven that you actually want it. And we'll talk to the literal context of testing in a little bit, but that's certainly resonating here. It's far better, right, as an acronym and a perspective here for emotions, and that's plays into our own perspective as builders. It's okay to fake it till you make it. So Chris, where you were mentioning sometimes like management doesn't even know we're Googling stuff, like that's okay, right? As long as we meet the goal and the business objective is achieved, like that's okay then. Like we found the means to the end, and I think that's fair, right? It's understood and acceptable. Again, in all those right perspectives we talked about. Cool quote here, like the cheapest, fastest, and most reliable components of any system are those that aren't there, right? So it's the idea of like, you're not gonna be any, more spend, any less. Now, granted, if it's not there, you're probably not getting a return on investment from it, but it's the idea of like, what is that right balance there? Because again, that's going to be the most reliable is the piece of the system that's not even there. And I thought that was pretty cool. Interesting way to look at it. Any quick thoughts to fake it till you make it?
We had a team that was struggling, and we recommended that they were doing demos every 2.5 days, and we recommended that they just do a fake it demo, because we didn't think the problem was the technology, but it was really the human aspect of it. And I'm telling you, that was the most successful demo I've ever seen in my life. And actually watching the team do it, they were so uncomfortable. I mean, these guys were so uncomfortable doing this mocking. Yep. But in the end, the business partner gave them more, the product owner gave them more good feedback than any of the other demos.
Yeah, so Dan, awesome. I have a question. I come from like the SOA world, right? Where mocking was standard issue, right? If you're doing services, you're gonna mock them and stub them, right? Why is it not more prevalent to do this? Like, why is it like it's not taught? It's not encouraged by management? Like, why is this not just baked into developers?
From my perspective, and I'm sure others could weigh in here too, there's a few dynamics that probably play in. One, simple laziness, right? It's generally hard, in a sense, to do it falsely compared to just doing it for real, right? Where you think about a mock or a fake or different things. Okay, you have to build extra in order to correlate to the idea of it not existing. Like that's just, in a sense, it's more spend, and realizing again that that's challenging and and sometimes hard or painful. And well, again, back to our human dynamic, we tend to try to avoid those perspectives. So I think that plays in a little. I think you maybe hit to it a little bit with the leadership management, business perspective of the buy-in. What do you need that, false reality for? We don't see any value in that, right? We see value in you talking to the real system. Let's push that forward. Okay, yes, true, but right, and you have to come back with that correlating, context of what's important, why it's important, and again, realizing as teams, right, we have a voice in what we're doing, and that technical value is almost just as important and sometimes more important than business value. So there's different perspectives that maybe play in, but that's just a couple quick thoughts to it. I don't know if anybody else has any quick thoughts too. Okay. That work, James? Is that
Yeah. I mean,
yeah?
I wish it was a more satisfactory answer, but it's probably
Oh, of course. Yeah, I know it's not what you wanted to hear, but that is true. So it's kind of like reality there. So for sure. Cool. All right. The good old KISS acronym. I think most of you are familiar with this, although I transpose the two S's. This kind of played through from something I read a long time ago. It's less about calling ourselves stupid and more about calling the stupid solution the better solution, right? So the idea of keep it stupid simple, right? As simple could be in a sense, and pushing from that perspective. So what's the good old, Beck and Cunningham dynamic? What's the simplest thing that could possibly work? Joel and I played with this one at one point in time. This is, of course, my favorite fun acronym to say in the whole deck. Right? And it's basically do that simplest thing that you could possibly do to keep you out of first, and these are kind of in priority order, talking to human resources and getting in trouble from the business perspective or organization perspective, of course, keeping you out of jail. And then lastly, of course, keeping you alive. So all of those play through in this fun, ridiculous acronym. But there's perspective there, and there's thresholds to that which we do, and why we may do something to a certain extent, but then maybe have to rectify it. And then, of course, simple is subjective, and it's realizing that you're trying to focus on just one thing. A lot of times when we're like, oh, this is so complex, it's usually because we've drawn in multiple different dynamics. This simply plays down to what I would, consider the good old single responsibility, perspective. Make sure the thing does one thing and does it well, right? So, as that plays through. So not all thoughts or solutions should turn into code. In fact, most shouldn't. And this is the idea to be aggressively deselective, right? A lot of times we're trying to think of what's all the things I would need to build? What's all the things I should put into this? What are all those possibilities that I need to vet out? And even from like my perspective of TDD, I'll tend to do that. And then I'll just write all these tests for all the things that I don't even really need. Okay, well, fair. Like, how do I flip that around, right? And this is the idea of being aggressively deselective, right? Think of that one thing you do need and start there and figure out if you need something else and then move on, right? This just kind of ties back to TDD as in, the design perspective of TDD more so than even the developer perspective, developing perspective. But again, that aggressively deselective, I think, is important.
In code, Dan, I've learned this. It's just been drilled into me this year. Of all the time that I've put in technology, this year it's really become apparent that this is kind of the best way. And what's the simplest thing that could possibly work is like the most impactful statement I've heard all year. How do you get that translated over to the design and requirements people? How all they can see is they want this big thing, right? And how do you convince them that the best thing to communicate to me is just the one thing, the simplest thing that works, the simplest thing that will provide value for your customers? I mean, you just say it that way, or is there some trick to bringing it over to the design side?
I think, as with most things, it's a learning dynamic, right? It's going to take time for them to think differently in a sense, right? They're used to saying, hey, here's the whole kit and caboodle. Here's everything we need, right? Run with it, right? It stems back from our old waterfall. Here's the whole big doc, whole big book of all the things. And we're getting better at, progressively, knocking that down. But we need to keep at it, right? It's like we're not done. We're only halfway along the journey there. When they still bring that bigger thing, right? Us as the right perspectives, and I often say, right, the 3 C's, right? The card leads to that conversation and kind of commitment. It's the idea of those things play together, but the conversation most important there, being able to take that larger thing and say, okay, well, we would break down into these pieces, right? If it's a feature, okay, you got a feature level, we break it down into these stories. Well, let's force rank prioritize those stories and say, okay, well, then let's just play a few of those to start with. So it's the idea of being able to help them learn the smaller bits that could be valuable, once they've learned that, hopefully they can take that to heart and then start feeding, right, smaller bites to us. But I don't think it's hard for that to just happen intrinsically. Of course, there's certain things out there that are supporting this, as customer centricity plays in, product driven contexts start to play in as a growing methodology and practice principle perspective. Just iterative agile stuff is helping in this way, but a lot of times it's still this opportunity to help feed that information back up, because they just aren't there yet. As much as we know the value of incremental delivery, they need to understand the value of incremental design too. I do actually hint to a perspective of that I think might play as one of our literal techniques that's going to come up in a few slides, so we can maybe retouch the topic there too. But yeah, just some thoughts there. Awesome. Cool. All right. ED, so either emergent design or evolutionary design, depending on how you might want to look at it. This might play in, James, to a little bit of what we were just talking about. So the idea of primitive whole, I know primitive whole is an overloaded phrase in a sense, but it takes a few different perspectives. But to me, this is the idea of the thin line, or what we'll talk to in a little bit. Again, I'll go ahead and throw this as a teaser out there, but MVP perspectives, right? What is that simplest, easy solution you could get out the door, learn from, and then build upon, right? So what is the primitive whole dynamic that you can go with, right? This the smallest whole, in a sense, and then build it up as you go, and build over time, in a sense, and add in that complexity as it's truly needed. Pursue high value, high risk items early. I think it's of course natural for us to pursue the high value things early, but I think very often we tend to take the high risk things or the scary things and say, oh, well, let's just get the easy stuff done first. And although that's right in a perspective and is meaningful, I try to flip that with teams, and I suggest, okay, well, cool, if you know it's easy, save it for later, because that's kind of canned, it's in the bag, and you should be good to do it. If it's risky, if it's hard, if it's complex, tackle that stuff early. A common quote I use a lot with teams is, the sooner we know we're behind, the more time we have to make it up. So I want to tackle that risky thing now, because if it's going to be problematic, I've given myself extra time to figure it out. But if I save that problematic thing for the end, I've run out of time to try to make it better, right? And it's therefore then going to just, of course, force a delay or force an extension. And, that's where problems tend to arise. So if we can tackle it early, learn from it early, evolve early, then we could be better off, right? So just a perspective to be mindful of again. Of course, scientific method, yeah, please.
So as somebody who is just starting out and who is nervous about asking stupid questions or doing things that would break an entire chunk of something that everybody on the team is working on, how do you recommend negotiating that? Wanting to demonstrate that I can do things and figure things out on my own, but also still very much happy to ask questions, lean on mentors and fellow teammates when something is truly beyond what I can do in the moment.
So the simplest dynamic I would play through with this as an answer is work with the team to establish what those thresholds may be. And I don't think it has to be a junior dynamic, right? Or a newer person dynamic, even a seasoned, senior developer that's just new to a new domain or new to a new organization, right? They're still going to have obvious, constraints and unknowns, right? But the idea of, as a team, have we established? So this is where, the idea of like team agreements, right, plays through and is important to me. The idea of, as a team, you guys have figured out how and why and what you will do in certain scenarios, right? I often say it's the accountability measure for a team. But one of the ones that I almost always certainly push for in a team agreement is something I've established as called the struggle limit. Establish as a team how long any one person, whether again, new junior to the team or old seasoned, Gristle veteran that's just, knows everything and all the things, they're still going to come against some problems. But if you've established that, okay, as a team, we've given ourselves, and I always suggest 15 minutes because that's ridiculously small. My favorite perspective of this that I had was one time I was like, all right, team, you need a 15-minute struggle limit. And there was a couple individuals, in fact, the lead on the team was adamant. He's like, no way, 15 minutes is way too small. It's like, okay, cool. Like this guy's going to come back with like, he needs a 2-week struggle limit. He's like, how about a half hour? Half hour seems like the right amount to struggle with. I was like, beautiful, dude. Like run with the half hour. Like good. Maybe it's an hour. Maybe it's, 2 hours. Maybe it's a half day. But as a team, you've established this is what is our limit for struggling. And if we don't get it, we're asking for help. Doesn't mean you're going to get an answer. Doesn't mean anybody else might know it, but it means we've at least established some threshold as a team of like, here's our gauge, right? If we've spent an hour on it, we're not making progress, whole team's going to ask for help. And then it takes that onus off of, I'm just the new person, I don't get it, to like, oh, okay, this is our limit. I hit it. I'm going to ask for that help, right? It kind of gives a gauge and a perspective both ways. So that's maybe something we could try as just a quick perspective. But other than that, individual, like give yourself that struggle limit. Let the team know, hey, I'm new to this. I'm going to give it an hour. If I don't get it, I'm going to come look for help, right? And again, you've set that precedence. You've set that perspective, and therefore, when you go to ask for help, it's not like, oh, she's back again, right? It's like, oh, cool. She's just looking for help, right? It's just finding that balance and being open to that. Perfect. So, yep, scientific method, real quick. Another, just I guess even a perspective to that question is like by setting it up as in like realizing, okay, if we set the theories, we run the experiments, and we take the learnings from it in some perspective, that can be pretty valuable. That can be pretty powerful, and trying to follow what we know is a good common standard. If it works for all of science, it's probably okay for most of our industry too. And then with all of these, give it time, right? Don't expect with all that stuff that it's usually just gonna make itself perfect right off the bat. So give yourself that time to learn, but then inversely, don't be afraid to fail, right? And by failing, calling up and throwing up the white flag, hey, I don't got this yet. Somebody help me out, because again, collectively, I'm a big person of team ownership, not individual ownership, and that idea of like we own all this stuff together. Doesn't always work, but at least that's the goal. The complex system that works is inevitably found to have evolved from a simple system, a simple system that works. So it's just this idea of like, if it's complex, usually doesn't have to be, or it didn't start there. It's an evolution to make it complex. And if we acknowledge that as in like, oh, this thing's starting to get complex. It was pretty simple when we started, but it's evolved to here. Maybe there's some right reason for separations of concern, or some right reason to divide and conquer in a meaningful way. Just again, being knowledgeable of that and accepting of that.
So,
cool.
So Dan, can I jump in?
Yeah.
And
yeah, please.
I think this originally I thought that what I was going to try to chime in on was not really related to this slide, but I think the last part really made it. To be, I think one of my favorite things is the failing fast, right? I think you gotta build something to know that it's not what you want, and then build something else, and that like so. But I think there comes like a gray area in I think in this idea of low code, not written code, and I want to share something that Artie posted in Twitch, and I really liked it. He said there's a conflict between being aggressively minimal, which you should be in terms of what you deploy, and aggressively valuing the learning that happens along the way. It's better to build something and throw it out in a week than to spend 3 weeks deciding not to build it. So this something resonates with me, because I think there's definitely multiple states of value of code, right? There's value that it gets into production, it goes all the way, it gets maintained, it gets all that. But then again, there is also very intrinsic value of actually coding it and learning from it, even if ultimately you throw it away. So I'd love to see, I think this should be something that is always kind of counterbalancing this topic, really, I would think.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, and thanks for bringing it up. I think for the prior, right, the business value out the door, that's easy, right? That's money. That's simple. It's like that equation is super simple in a sense. However, the latter of like, oh, the learning value, that less like that intrinsic value of these things really hard to try to correlate to a number, right? And try to express in a meaningful way. So it makes it so, though, in that way that we have to be more intentional about it, right? Hey, as a group or as a team, and like this is where I love spikes, and spikes are not pointed, right? They're just a time box period of time kind of perspective. It's like, hey, we're going to play this spike intentionally to learn. Okay, cool. Like everybody gets that. It's a spend, but it's a spend for a limit, compared to this idea of like, oh yeah, we're going to take a month to build this thing out and then just figure out if it's right valuable or not. And again, we'll talk to one or two literal techniques that I think might support that. But it's that perspective. And I think, again, generally, until you've spent a month building something and then throwing it all away, that value is hard to correlate until, of course, it's like, oh, well, there's, a month's worth of a pair, building something that's got nothing from it. That's the harshest way to accept that value in a sense. But you reminded me of a perspective I bring a lot to teams. There's two common realities in our industry. One, the business doesn't know what they want until they see it, until it's done. 100%. And then we as builders don't know how to build it until we've actually built it. Right. And like both of those being the realities, it's like, okay, well, how do we make that window really small then, right? How do we go to a 2-day iteration? How do we, get that feedback every week? How do we, again, pivot to that idea of small windows are always better, and driving from that. So yeah, great perspective. Thanks, Chris.
That's a great point. I'm in the consulting services delivery part of this business, and that last point makes it so hard because it's very hard to estimate how long something will take if you're kind of estimating a moving target, and no company is going to say, okay, yeah, you can have unlimited money until you get us the value that we want. That's also a very big challenge. So we live in the world of eating our shorts and or shirt or whatever the saying is, and also profiting very handsomely. So it's kind of a risk thing for sure.
There's always a fine line, sure. And playing through in that respect is just knowing and understanding. There's a big difference between no constraints and known constraints. That idea of like, that's the boundaries we work within. So cool.
Absolutely.
All right. Absolutely. So I think that was maybe my last figuratively. Oh no, we reference at least MVP here. And I always thought this cartoon explained it way more than I ever could. This is the idea of shifting away from, whatever methodology you're taking, but the idea of, build everything from, base to everything out the door, or the iterative model, right? Of, the perspective there. And this cute cartoon that you can easily find on Google is always better at explaining it, I think. That I guess to MVP though, minimum viable product, I can say it so people understand what it means if they don't know, has varying degrees of perspective now. The organization I'm in, they can't decide if they want to call it MVP, minimum viable product. They're a product different organizations. They also like MMP, minimum marketable product. And then I've always heard there's minimum marketable features as well, MMFs. So any variation of that is the idea of what's the thin slice kind of tracer bullet idea to learn end to end and validate that the system works and that we get some, meaningful results from it before we build everything. Right. So the skateboard is going to roll. Does it roll in the right direction? Okay, we've learned something. We know that wheels are the right choice now in moving this thing as opposed to a rocket. Cool. Like we figured that out. Now we can continue to build on it. Although personally, I still want the hoverboard. So I'd like to see the board without the wheels at some point. Just accept that as my MVP, but still waiting on it.
Daniel, cool. This is James again. Do you find that thinking this way about minimum viable product has a profound effect on architecture? Because that's kind of the direction I see things going for us, is we have been grouping things together and calling them a feature that are really a series of functions that could be their own products. But because we group them together, we sort of architect them very tightly and together. Yep. Right. So I see if we start moving towards MVP, we might start teasing that apart more.
I think that's where the value lies in. Yes. Is that ability to break it down to get to only the thing that really matters. Right. Because I always say it's about the force ranking. It's about the idea of like, right, you might not get all of it, the good old 80-20 rule. all of that plays through, right? If you're halfway through something and the budget gets cut, do you have something valuable, or are you just awash, right? Like that perspective is good to keep. So like if the lights got turned off at any day within, this is why I'm a big proponent and always encourage teams, daily incremental value, right? The idea of with what you built today, could you ship it, right? Maybe it doesn't have to actually go out the door, but at least it's a valuable increment in some meaningful way that helps build up. And then eventually, again, when that light gets turned off or somebody says, hey, we've spent enough on this product, we're good to go with what we have at least, and we can, use that to get some of that investment back or whatever it is. And that's where I think, again, just playing through, those perspectives is good. And absolutely, architecture to me should be part of that conversation, just like design is, just like all the rest of the things are, right? It's about all agreeing as a collective group, organization, team, however you want to, organize it, in alignment with that. Because they all play together, of course, or should play together. Cool. All right. Cool. Now we're going to flip over to a couple literal techniques, and these might go a little faster because they're pretty self-explanatory. First one here, pretotyping. I think this is another reference that came about from Joel's guidance. So in case you hadn't figured this out, Joel gave me some good perspective to writing this talk back when I was working on it for Code Mesh. So some things in here he'll recognize for sure. So pretotyping is, avoid the can we build it or will we build it kind of mentality. Instead, focus on should we even build it at all? If we build it, will people actually use it or buy it? Right, that type of dynamic. Pretotypes make it possible to make a go, no-go decision at a fraction of the cost of true prototypes. So pretotypes, I guess, defined is the idea of it's the pre-prototype. It's if you were to say, okay, the prototype is literally that, mocked out high reference UI that's just, simple pass through and, simple connection to the database. Like the pretotype is the napkin drawing, right? Of okay, cool, let's get that napkin drawing bounced off a few folks and see if they'll actually take, advantage of this in a meaningful way. Because it's the idea of you could just spend, hours or days, deciding if this thing is valuable or not, as opposed to, weeks or months or, basically pennies on the dollar in a sense. So design until you feel you understand the problem, write code until you realize you don't. And this again was the one I was kind of thinking of, James's, and this is certainly where spikes play in. This is certainly where again, fail fast and learn early. Our early feedback is certainly going to play in, because it's just this idea of again, only do that which you need in order to learn, and then once you've learned, okay, write some more code to figure it out.
So Daniel, somebody suggested that this whole meetup is a pretotype, and you can comment on that. But also, I just want to lay out. So Chris and I, the way we work together, right? We come up with, okay, we have this pipeline that we've made. We have a principle that we want that pipeline to make developers more autonomous, to make their lives easier, and to check all the boxes, right? Yep. So we use right now Terraform for infrastructure as code. And so we come up with a sort of basic what's next, right? What thing would people use, right? What would developers want? That's our sort of, if we build it, will they buy it, right? Yep. And then from there, we actually just start writing code and testing it out and bringing users in to see if we have understood the problem correctly and we're solving it. Is that pretotyping, or is that going a step beyond that?
To me, that's a step beyond. As soon as you've started writing code, you've started to spend, in a sense, right?
Okay.
Is there a way to learn about that sooner? Now, I'll blatantly say that's not always the case. You can't always get away with that, right? Sometimes you just need the real system to work in a meaningful way to learn from it, and that's part of it. But what could you do that's just one step ahead of that, even, right?
So what about software modeling, right, in embedded environments? Does that count as pretotyping if you're just generating a model and looking at it?
Yeah, I would suggest it is. Now, again, it's how much spend goes into that, and is there even a step ahead of that? Right? The idea of if you drew it out and laid out, on 3x5 cards, how that system interacts and the pieces that worked in different ways, and then had a conversation with one or two folks, right? Like, was that valuable enough and a short enough, small enough, tiny window to learn in a meaningful way that makes that next step that much more, I don't want to say guaranteed, but that much more likely of being in the right direction, right? And the ability to offer ourselves that pivot point again. And back to that, quote I used earlier, like that sooner we know we're behind, sooner we can pivot. That's kind of like where this plays out.
Yeah. I keep asking because I think for Chris's benefit, I think this seems most beneficial in my mind, and anybody with experience can tell me otherwise, but in my mind, this seems most beneficial for like embedded environments, right? Where the spend is really high, right?
Yeah.
Once you start writing code, it seems to me like we need to bring this to our embedded people and see if they're doing anything like this.
Yep. No, I think that's interesting because that's certainly your perspective. I would have suggested somebody from maybe a web front end would have been like, oh yeah, this is where we do a lot of the, the mocking and or like maybe the designers play in, right? And they're out there blazing ahead with just the the mocked out UI in a meaningful perspective. But what I don't think we take into account is there's still a lot of spend that we put even there, right? Like, okay, so your designers took a month to build out all the prototypes that are being used to drive the right conversation around the actual UI. Great, like that's still a good, first step. But what could have been put in place even before that to catch any of those concerns? And
right, so like sort of hand-drawn UI, UX, right? And there's more
absolutely.
More primitive prototyping before you do the actual prototype. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
What is an embedded environment?
Good question.
I think you're on mute, James.
Yep. Go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead. I was going to say you probably can answer better than I can.
So for us, it's systems, like inside a vehicle, right? Small microprocessors, maybe a radio, right, or a telematics module, might be your cluster or your braking module. We consider all of those to be embedded environments, where a lot of it's firmware based, basically, instead of what you would think of as typical application software.
I help clarify.
So it sounds like embedded systems are responsible for doing one single thing.
They often can be, but
have multiple functions actually. As much as possible, you want them to be responsible for one thing, but that's not always the case. And some are larger, but mainly it's that they're firmware based. They can't be handled with like a cloud system, right? It's got to be embedded in the actual system that it's in.
So it can't be accessed from the outside.
Right, and not in the sense that you could use compute space on the cloud. It has to be on that system.
Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. No, good clarifying question. Thank you. Cool. So that's Pretotyping. Of course, now we get into a couple that I'm sure you guys are probably a little bit more familiar with, but test-driven design or driven development. So TDD, right? Certainly writing our tests before we write code helps assure we only write the necessary code meant to, pass those tests. Doing so, of course, makes for clean, simple code, which is good. And then ensures the individual, subunits and the little bits are doing the right thing, all of which is, understood and valuable. So certainly can draw into that if any, anybody thinks the discussion is deeper, but pretty straightforward. Yeah.
I got to make a plug. We are going to do another TDD event with Canton Coders. We're going to build a kata for TDD for protocol buffers later this month. I've got it most of the way designed and ready.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to catching that one because that's an interesting new space for me, and plenty of all the TDD I've done in other realms. That one's new to me, so I'm excited about it. And in fact, the next one I get to, I also do. It's again less codey because that tends to be where my talks go lately. But I do a comparison TDD versus ATDD, which is what we're going to cover next. And then I'll give a quick kind of visual to that. But to me, the biggest advantage of TDD as the design context is it provides that ability to protect yourself from you, or you from yourself, right? So a lot of times as I'm writing TDD, it's really my buffer of like, okay, I'm going to write this test because I know I need this next thing. I'm going to write the code for that next thing, and it's green, cool, I can be done now. As opposed to, oh, well, think of all these other cool things I could do. And I could make this thing so cool, and I can make it so impressive, and I could, knock the socks off of the guy that's going to peer review it, or gal that's going to peer review it. It's going to be amazing. I don't need any of that. Like, I just needed to make it, add up 2 + 2. Cool. Like, I didn't need all this fancy stuff to do it. It's simple function, right? Like, boom, boom, done. Oh, fair. Like, it's that idea of, again, TDD to me was always a good, protector of that which I would want to, in a sense, gold plate or build above and beyond what's really necessary. And it kind of gives me, as a threshold mechanism to that, a way to throttle it in a sense. So that TDD to ATDD, right? This idea of acceptance tests driving the system. Same approach, of course, as TDD, and at least similar approach. Tests are generally written from a higher level perspective, whether it's a business stakeholder perspective, or even if it's into the behavior side of things, drawing that out in a meaningful way. So, of course, helps the devs to identify the appropriate code to write. That is code that reflects the outcomes desired. And I think that's pretty important and powerful. And it's meant to ensure that that business value is met. Now, just like TDD and the unit tests, like these might be cucumber gherkin tests, hopefully still integrated both into CI/CD in a meaningful way that becomes part of your test harness as you go along. So, of course, a benefit in the now to help you guide building the right thing, but then absolutely a benefit, continuing on as the code continues on, in that right testing perspective.
Daniel,
yeah.
Is there a significant difference between ATDD and BDD?
Yes, and I'll kind of, I guess, explain it because I didn't really get into it. I do cover that a little bit in that other talk, but it's the idea to me of acceptance test driven development, and it's kind of what this last, the white text here describes. It's from that business perspective, and therefore it helps the business understand what they're doing and how they're doing it, why they're doing it. Where unit level TDD helps the dev do it. Behavior, BDD, behavior driven development, is kind of that realm in between. It's driven from a dev perspective, but it's focused on a behavior dynamic as opposed to either lower level unit or higher level, business functionality. So it's kind of, to me, that sweet spot in the middle. And generally, again, tools, could probably go both ways. You could do BDD with something like, JUnit and, Java perspective, but you could also do it with Cucumber and Gherkin at a, acceptance test kind of perspective. And I think, again, it could come from either perspective and still be meaningful. But I often say ATDD business driven, BDD still builder driven or dev driven in a sense.
So is
That's how I kind of
ATDD easier for the business folks to adapt to? Like if I wanted to really push for us to start doing requirements as code, right? Would it be easier for the folks that are writing today in Word, right, to write ATDD or BDD?
I think ATDD, because it's driven from that business perspective, right? It's in their language. Now, of course, there has to be the bridge, right? Of you're going to go back and, alter the specs within that Cucumber, Gherkin dynamic to correlate when they say this thing, this is what they really mean and how we validate it from a system perspective. But they get to write it in their language. Now, BDD could still be in their language. So again, the builder could be like, hey, I'm going to write this BDD test and it's still readable in a sense. Again, that's if you're shifting to the higher side of it in a human language in a sense, rather than a code language. So it's just given that perspective. And then again, this diagram, I think, kind of helps show it and helps articulate where this plays through. So if I was to add in BDD here, it's a slightly thinner, probably about the same thickness as the ATDD, realizing there's usually more unit tests, more TDD that happens to, right? You're going to do multiple TDD tests, unit tests, to meet the need for one higher level acceptance test is kind of like the goal there, and why the line is thicker for the TDD circle. But the ATDD circle is just, again, this idea of it's thinner, it's lighter weight, You know, they take longer to get to green. They're usually a little bit more expensive to write just due to the complexity of it and the need to manage that. Again, if you're using the right tools, the business stakeholders can write it in a standard format, but in English language that we can then turn into real tests in a meaningful way with system dynamics, right? So it's that idea of that's what makes it convenient for them. And that, James, I think that's where that advantage comes in, is they can write it in their native tongue in a sense. And that's powerful, right? So,
Interesting.
but yeah, still the idea that somebody has to translate, right? It's usually not the state getting better, but not the state that the translation is magic like some of our other things. But here we kind of talked to, and I didn't really cover it in the deck, but the red-green refactor premise, right? Of like, start with a red test, you know, work on it till you get the test green, and then refactor in a meaningful way to clean up the code. So same premise there. Awesome. All right. I like the thug life kind of this one. We'll whack, right? It's just like, well, it's whack, but it's we'll whack. So it's like that much cooler. But this is the idea of well-written acceptance criteria. This goes back to the same point, James, of like, if you're writing that, you know, acceptance criteria in the format of like the given when then, that is translated through Gherkin and Cucumber into a meaningful actual test, right? Like you're getting the best of all worlds there. But even if it's not used in a meaningful way, test-driven perspective, at least from a clarity perspective, right? Acceptance criteria is a huge dynamic that I think a lot of teams don't take advantage of, but it's the idea of we're writing that in a meaningful way to help understand what we're really after, what's really being requested, and allowing us to have that conversation around it and share that in a meaningful way. So that all team members get it, right? And anybody can run with it in a sense. It needs to be realistic and achievable, of course. This one I love. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And a lot of times, right, just because the card was written with the business perspective of well-written acceptance criteria, if the team gets it and they don't know what the heck it means, we're still off, right? Like we're still not guaranteed. But it's the idea of we need to have the conversation around that acceptance criteria and communicate in a sense around it so that we can be on the same page. And until that's an actual conversation, it usually doesn't happen unless you're working well enough together as a team in a meaningful way for long enough that of sort in a sense of sorts, I guess, can be you know, more intrinsic just from the nature of, you know, being a well-functioning team. But of course, all of this plays into avoiding building the wrong thing. So again, it's the idea of, you know, if we can have good acceptance criteria that prevents us from writing the code that we thought we needed but didn't really because the business hadn't asked for it, that's a savings. That's a good thing.
I think this should definitely be contributing, a huge contributor to the amount of money wasted in software development is, like you say, building the wrong thing, not knowing what needs to be built. I mean, you know, the definition of ready in stories has to be that the acceptance criteria is clear. Otherwise, yeah, the likelihood you're going to build the wrong thing is so great. And this is even more than just software too. Meeting notes after meetings, you know, that you have with people, right? It makes sure that we're all we all agreed on something in the meeting. Now everyone thinks they agreed on the same thing. No one agreed on the same thing. We just wasted that meeting. So I think this is prevalent in just human interaction. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yep. Cool. Other thoughts to this? Awesome. I had a fleeting moment of a brilliant thought and then it was gone. So unfortunately, we all missed it.
I should have shut up. I think I rambled and then
it was directly driven from something you said, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to mention that, and then it was gone. But no, it's good. Cool. I think we're close, if not one or two more. Okay. All right. Yeah. So DOR and DOD, and the idea of a definition of ready and a definition of done. This goes back to that kind of thing we were hinting to before with team agreements. It's a common understood, you know, well articulated, you know, simple contract in a sense of like, this is what it means for something to be ready for us as a team and for us to be done with it as a team. And that can certainly be, again, you know, if you're working in some methodology perspective and following a board, right? In the columns of the board, there can be entrance exit criteria or different dynamics to these things, but I tend to think of DOR and DOD as the high level things, right? If acceptance criteria is your definition of done for a card, the DOR and DOD are more the things that would play over all cards, right? It's the idea of for anything that we would want, our definition of done says that it, passes all regression tests, or, it's all such a thing of certain levels, and therefore there's that common agreement to it. And these can be really powerful for teams to, keep that standard dynamic and standard approach in play. Of course, they still need to be driven from realistic and achievable dynamics. But it helps us with this meet the need and only the need, which is really easy and helps us not to overcomplicate things. So I kind of put this like rules are meant to be broken, make sure they're manageable and have some kind of ranking or priority. So, right, in the team agreements perspective, in a sense, or definition of ready or done, there's going to be times where your guidelines will need to be broken. But it's that ability to have the conversation. Hey, I broke this guideline for this reason. Cool. The team calls me out for it. I'm safe. Like, we've got this understanding. Or inversely, if you broke it and didn't realize it, or you broke it, I don't want to say maliciously, but like intentionally, but not harmfully, then it's the idea that you can have a conversation around it. Okay, cool. Like, this is why this played out this way. I had to break this rule because we needed to get stuff in production right now. Like, that happens. It's a thing. Okay, well, that's why we had it. But they're there to guide us, but sometimes we got to go outside the guidelines, and that plays through. Cool. All right, so we're going to quickly kind of recap. I know we're pushing time here a little bit. I appreciate everybody sticking around. So this is definitely a slide I didn't need to have build out so slow. So thanks for waiting as we're seeing all of these right things. One more, maybe? Yay. Cool. So recapping, of course, all these kind of figurative, like the mindset dynamics that you could play into, things like Yagni and KISS and that stuff, and then the literal things that you could maybe take advantage of, and pretotyping, or good acceptance criteria, and again, all of these being a collection of things that we can be mindful of and kind of keep a perspective to when we're talking and thinking about code that we don't need to write in a meaningful way. So there, yeah, that's that. I think all of those are covered. This says we share the deck in a meaningful way, whatever is the right way for us to do this. Not sure how we're currently sharing decks as a group, but however we share it, there's some references here of just some good articles, things you can follow up with. And with that, it kind of gets us to the QA. So certainly opening it up to the group here, and then kind of driving it out in any meaningful way. Again, we can do the lean coffee or whatever makes sense. Follow this, the maybe lean beer, lean whiskey. I don't know, whatever seems right here after syncing up here. Anybody keeping an eye on Slack or the Twitch stream? Happy to take any questions and thoughts from this. Well, we got a moment.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, let's. I think we'll probably stop the Twitch stream right now, and we've had a few questions, so hopefully some of those people will join us. We're going to have the lean coffee. I'm going to post the link to this Zoom session. Sorry, did you have another slide?
Awesome. No, this just wraps it up. So
okay.
This was something I heard at one point in time, right? The whole it was a dynamic some bigwig put out there at some point in time. It's like, oh no, now that you've learned this, go into the world and write beautiful code. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I like that. But this is inverse. Now that you've kind of learned these things, go into the world and don't write beautiful code. Right? It's the idea of like avoid code if you can, because that's.
But I think it's well written, because it's not necessarily the full inverse of don't write code. It's don't write some code that you would have written, right? So still write code, but be very pragmatic about what code. I think that's
yeah, exactly.